The pressure on the dairy industry to prove its sustainability credentials has never been greater. Dr. Stephanie Bullen is a dairy veterinarian and the National Animal Health Welfare Lead at Dairy Australia. With a history in milk quality and as a custodian of industry programs spanning countdown and in-calf, as well as heifer genomics and antimicrobial stewardship, Steph has spent her career ensuring animal health and sustainability go hand in hand. She's joined today by a panel of experts. We have two presenters from day one, including Scott McDonald, our favourite infrastructure and effluent specialist, as well as Dr. Jeffrey Bewley, our Holden USA global technology and genetics expert. These people will be joined by Dr. Andy Hancock, who is leading Dairy Australia's Sustainable Animal Care Initiative, as well as Jack Holden, who is the Director of Ridge Road Advisory, a sustainability strategist with decades of experience. Together, they'll tackle the biggest challenges and opportunities improving our environmental and animal welfare credentials. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Stephanie Bullen and our panel.
Fabulous. I've got a pretty high-powered panel here, which is, I don't know whether it's probably equal parts daunting and equal parts exciting. So yeah, thank you, Eve, for the really lovely introduction. And I just wanted to do a big shout out to the rest of the Herd Organising Committee for an amazing program. I've gotten so much out of the last couple of days, and I hope that the panel session today will continue to build upon some of those insights that have been gained. But yes, I've got lots and lots of questions that I'd love to fire at these guys and others that have presented. And I was thinking, Deanne, it would have been amazing to add Todd to the panel session too. So we'll remember that one for next time. So as E mentioned, our panel session today is around supporting industry sustainability credentials. And I'm going to start by setting the scene, and I really want to minimise my talking and hand it over to the panellists. So I'm going to start with Jack. So Jack's got a long history spanning right across the dairy supply chain, most recently as General Manager of Sustainability at Fonterra, before branching out into your own advisory business. Jack, I'm going to ask you firstly, why should we care about sustainability?
I mean, the primary reason is, I think, is certainly our customers care, right? So if we're in the business of selling more product, if we're in the business of selling that product at a higher price, then there's a commercial reason to buy into the story. Clearly, there's a whole heap of other reasons in terms of other stakeholders around us, investors, the people who work in our businesses, and regulators are all part of the ecosystem of people that we're trying to meet their expectations, exceed their expectations. It's a commercial benefit for us that we actually understand and prepare ourselves for their sustainability agenda before they define it for us. We have to define it for them.
And Jack, if we don't come on board, are we at risk potentially in Australia of losing or potentially getting lower prices for some of our products on that international market?
I think that's it. It's not so much that there is a price premium for having a sustainability attribute of some form or other. It's more that the whole of our volume needs to satisfy the customers in that process. There's a whole bundle of things they want to see in that, and sustainability attributes is part of that bundle. And so that's a very big volume play. It's not a tiny little niche part for a small part of our product that goes to a very niche sort of customer. It's for the big quick service restaurants. It's for the Nestle's and Mars of this world. It's for people who take very large volumes. We've got customers that buy cheese from Tasmania. They've been doing it into Japan for 30, 40 years. And the sustainability piece is just one of the proof points that actually gives us a price premium from those cheeses. And it's a really difficult place for us to say, look, we can drop that and still keep that price premium. The customers won't be satisfied with that.
Yeah, great. So it's really about having a seat at the table rather than, seeking those premiums.
I think it is. It's also about controlling the agenda, right? So if we are out there saying this is what sustainability looks like, and the best definition in my view is the Dairy Sustainability Framework. It talks about people and environment and livelihoods and animals. if we define it, and we know it as an industry much more than customers do, they're relying on us to define it. But if we don't do that, they'll do it for us, and they'll come back with ideas that don't work for us, right? They won't have the win-wins in there. They'll have things that really suit them. When you spend time with customers and try and sort of understand what they're looking for, they will come back with some good ideas, but they'll come back with some perhaps not so good ideas too. So, when you spend time with their marketing people and, sales people, and they come back with things like, 100% solar powered grass, right? So, yeah, we could use an attribute like that, but I'm not sure we'll sustain it for a very long time. Dolphin friendly milk, it sounds pretty attractive, but it's really not going to cut it, right? So we have to go with things that actually work for us, right? Instead of giving us something that is a great idea, but it's not going to last.
Yeah, wonderful. That's fantastic, Jack. And I think that's, again, a beautiful segue into my next question. So moving really into the pre-gate farm data connection, just to continue on our kind of theme for this morning session. Andy, we've heard from Jack that customers do really care about what's happening on farm, but they don't necessarily know the right questions. You have recently stepped into Dairy Australia and really looking after the sustainability credentials in that animal care space. What are we telling customers about animal care at the moment? And what are some of the challenges you think in terms of being able to tell our story?
Yeah, thanks, Steph. And I should, full disclosure in this audience, I'm not a data nerd, and I've heard that term a few times the last couple of days. I wouldn't even call myself a data enthusiast. I just care about what the outcomes are and what value we can get for the industry-graded good with the data. But there is a lot of value there. And just to tack onto your comment, Jack, the other benefit to demonstrating that credentials is not just from a consumer's perspective, but in a lot of the work we do in animal welfare and environment as well, there's that getting ahead of potential regulatory overreach. So what the consumers say then can translate into potentially bad policy. And so we want to be proactive to make sure that that we're not sort of forced with the stick to do things that don't make sense from an on-farm perspective. But sorry, to answer your question, Steph, I mean, where we're going, it's a really exciting time so the Australian Dairy Sustainability Framework is there to promote and protect the industry and help do those things, communicate those things that Jack's talking about. And it's a really exciting time because we're in the process now of actually updating all of the commitments. So it's a great framework. It was industry leading. So the dairy industry was the first to have a sustainability framework over 10 years ago. But because it is so old now, it's actually starting to need some updating and future proofing. So we're going through that process of updating. And so we're looking at what are the things that consumers are, back to your question, Steph, wanting us to demonstrate from an animal welfare perspective, and we've got a whole bunch of new targets which we're just about to formalise, which is really exciting. I think the challenges, and we're going to face challenges going forwards with these new targets because they probably do require more accurate and in-depth pre-farm gate data, and that's going to be really important for us to demonstrate, well, what value are we projecting with this information outwards, and then what value can you use it for on-farm, so that we can justify the time spent and the extra administrative burden of actually having to collect that data. So, whilst there are challenges, there's also a lot of opportunity there as well. That answer all your points there?
Yeah, it did, absolutely, Andy. I think one of the things I'd love to unpick a little bit more with you is perhaps the move from self-reporting to perhaps sort of more automated or second or third party data expectations from customers. So at the moment in the sustainability framework, a lot of those animal welfare credentials are self-reported by farmers via the Animal Husbandry and Genetics Survey. There seems to be more appetite by processors, by customers, by other industry stakeholders around, just taking a couple of steps back in terms of how that data is actually collected on farm. Can you speak to that, Andy?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So, currently we use the survey data that's collected every 3 years. It's really a robust data set, but it's every 3 years. We're at the point now where we need to be using something that's more objective, that's not self-reporting, but also that's collected easily and regularly on farm, it's accurate and can be updated. So there's sort of what's automated and what we can use, technology to provide and make it easier for pre-farm entry. But there's always going to be some requirement for accurate on-farm data entry, and that, single entry multi-use thing concept I really like that. And what's happening that Erica just talked about with Data Connect is going to be really important for us as well, and helping to demonstrate those animal welfare commitments. With respect to compliance and auditing, that's certainly come up as a big potential barrier for some of the stuff that's going to be going forwards in terms of animal care assessment programs, for example. It's just one example. And I'm sure there's examples in the environmental space, which I won't speak to because it's not my area. But whatever we want to put in place has to be practical from an administrative perspective. So if we can tie it in with auditing processes that are already ongoing on farm, and what's really critically important is that it's a co-design process. So when we develop this animal care program, it will have a steering committee that includes pre and post farm gate representatives to make sure that what we put in place makes sense, and then we can actually fund it and resource it as well.
Yeah, awesome. That's fantastic. And I think one of the kind of big themes throughout the last 2 days has been around, it's really nice for industry to want this data, and, it's important for maintaining our markets and ensuring that we have access to some of these higher value markets. But I'm keen, Scott, to hear from you in terms of what are some of the potential benefits of, measuring and monitoring, whether it's, animal welfare, or as Jack alluded to, some of the environmental credentials. What are the benefits directly to farmers to having a really, having their finger on the pulse in terms of how they're tracking in their own business? I mean, we spoke yesterday in the break around, some effluent systems and, making it easier to get permits and regulatory approvals and things like that. Can you talk to me about the benefits to farmers by having a really good idea of, how their business is tracking in some of these sustainability areas?
Yes, farmers have been doing it for years, so every farm has a sustainability goal for future, whether you're grazing or intensive. The ones that are moving into the house systems, they are scrutinised in planning. So for example, to get a permit, you have to carry out what we call an environmental impact statement, which is potentially a sustainability report for the farm now and in the future. We know of a development, they spent $60,000 for an 800-page environmental report sent back by the EPA, so it doesn't meet our standards. So the EPA is asking, not only do you have these environmental projections going forward, but we want weather stations on your farm. We want to know what's coming in with weather. If there's odour complaints, you have to have registers, you have to have maintenance schedules, contingency plans, biosecurity plans, mortality plans. They want to predict your farm in the future, irrespective of the consequence to the environment or the communities. You've got to have plans in place. So these farms are scrutinised in planning. Once they're up and developing, they are still scrutinised because they're on the radar. They're large farms with a lot of animals being housed. Farmers do it naturally anyway. So the big sticking point, that the big focus on some of these farms is nutrient accounting. So for the first time in Australian history, we've got farm developments have got more manure coming on their farm than they actually have land. And the agencies are basically saying, well, if you haven't got land for these nutrients coming out of the animal manure, how are you going to manage it? So they're now looking at export strategies. So farmers giving away or selling or moving manure off their farm into other farms or other hydroponic hothouses, for example, because they don't have enough land. If you don't have land and you can't account for your nutrients, your development is capped. So we had one proposal, 3,000 cows, three free stalls. They could only get the 2,600 cows based on nutrient accounting because they don't have the land. So they've got to have environmental solutions to figure out how they can make that gap up.
Yeah, interesting, really interesting. Jeff, we're, as we heard from Scott, we're sort of, moving into these contained housing systems more and more, as Scott covered in his presentation. Are there any watch-outs from the US from a sustainability perspective that, not necessarily as it relates to contained housing, but broadly across all of the various different dairy systems that, perhaps should be on our radar here in Australia?
Certainly, we're more accustomed to the housing system being the predominant system in the United States. And I think a couple of things that I've seen, first of all, I think it's very important when we're looking at sustainable metrics for housing systems to not make it about the housing system itself, to say this system is better than this particular system for whatever metric we're looking at, to be a bit more outcomes driven than system driven. So what I mean by that is, like if I'm looking at a metric for kind of trying to get at measuring cow comfort, I would rather see something like line time or percentage of cows that are lame or percentage of cows with hock abrasions, because that's an outcome that we can achieve a high level across different systems than to make it about the particular system itself. Yeah. And the same thing for from the environmental perspective. I get the question a lot of times, having done a lot of work with compost barns, is the compost barn better or worse from an environmental perspective? And I think the answer is it depends. And I think there's different metrics that it's probably better for, and other metrics that it's probably worse for. So that's probably the biggest lesson, is to be outcomes driven rather than system driven.
Yeah, excellent. That's really good advice, Jeff. And while I've got you, Jeff, while I've got your attention, we heard from Todd this morning around, I guess, potential risks to farmers with having their data supplied to central databases and aggregated for the benefits of whether it's the commercial company that's collecting the data or industry or otherwise. I'm really keen to hear from you. We've talked about our sustainability framework and being able to demonstrate our sustainability credentials. Are there any risks to farmers that you can see, Jeff, by us collecting and aggregating this data at an industry level?
There are, unfortunately, I think, some risks to think about with data. And the main one that I think about and worry about is what if the data gets into the wrong hands? So there's the security aspect of that. And what if it's used for a purpose other than its intended purpose? And I think a lot of the questions that we have around aggregation of data and whether we take a data set that was originally intended for this and use it for this come down to maybe it wasn't really intended to be used for our other use. Even when we think about, I think about genetic evaluations a lot, for example, and we talk about using the data from sensors for genetic evaluations. Well, it's a different standard that we have for a genetic evaluation than what we would do for day-to-day use of those technologies. So sometimes they weren't designed to do what we're asking them to do from a genetic evaluation perspective. And the same issue comes with sustainability. Maybe it wasn't really designed. One of the examples that I use a lot of times is when I think about lameness, unfortunately a lot, and
so do I, Jeff.
So I may be a farm that decides that I want to invest in a lameness detection technology because I'm proactive and I want to reduce the lameness in my farm. But now suddenly I have a measure of my lameness. So it tells me that 20% of my cows are lame. But my neighbor isn't measuring lameness. So when you look at his records, he has 2%.
Yeah.
So suddenly I look bad, but it's just because I'm looking for the problem. And then if that gets into the wrong hands and they say, wow, this guy's really got a lame herd, it's just because I'm measuring it.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be real cautious on that aspect.
Yeah, amazing points, and some things that I've been thinking about far too much in the last couple of months, Jeff, so I'm very glad that you raised them. Jack, I'm going to come back to you, so we're going to bring it back up to the sort of, whole of supply chain. How much data do customers actually want? Do they care about Jeff's herd that's got 20% lameness, or do they just want to care that we're doing something and that we're measuring it?
So the downside case is that when something goes wrong, they care a lot about what it is that's in the media, right? So there's a negative screen for that. But the game here is actually to have a science-based trust-building process. And the data is it's a prop. It's a tool in our toolbox for the storytelling about this is a really compelling product from a really honest and trustworthy industry. Farmers generally are well-trusted parts of our communities. Politicians, journalists, real estate agents, there's daylight between them and farmers. So farmers telling the story and the agricultural industry telling its own story with the right data points that this is science-based, people are looking at it, it's highly monitored, there are alerts that turn things on and off so that the right people get to see this and intervene to control whatever whatever could be out of spec, is all they want to see. They just want to trust that the people who know the stuff better are really doing it well. And they don't have the bandwidth. Customers don't have the bandwidth to dive into the detail unless it's a really high profile issue that's something gone wrong somewhere. And we have to obviously protect ourselves from all of that all the time. So the data is just our insurance for that sort of thing, but it also is the thing that makes customers sticky. So we're out there looking for the wealthiest, hungriest customers to buy every piece of our product that we can possibly sell. This is not a commodity, right? So we're not in a commodity market. And we have to think of this as food for high-value hotel chains in Malaysia or something like that, and they want this much, and we're going to exceed their expectations on that, and they're going to pay above the odds for it, right? So that's the mindset we're trying to take here. And so they're not going to want a bundle of data around that, but if they find out that something went wrong and we weren't honest about it, that market's gone, right? And that's the bit we're trying to hang on to those, find those big customers, find those big wealthy customers and protect it at all costs. That's, keep their trust, keep their wallet open and keep the product selling for the best possible price.
Yeah, awesome. Great point. So we've still got a little bit of time. So Andy, I'm going to throw you another one unprompted. I haven't discussed this with you beforehand, but Jack's point around, protection from, an expose or risks being, really quite important, and then having the underpinning data to actually demonstrate that we're being proactive. Can you talk to us a little bit, Andy, about the work that industry is doing to be on the front foot around some of those issues in the animal care space?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I'm sort of glad you threw to me because I wanted to sort of build on Jack's comment again.
Great. Good, you won't slap me later.
Yeah, no, we talk a lot about this when we're talking about the surplus calf issue, where historically it's a protective, reactive approach, and we're making sure that we can look after the animals as best as possible, but just trying to avoid any big blowback. But actually moving to a more sort of proactive approach where we're looking to leverage the opportunity of dairy beef, and I think that's actually a role to play across I'm really excited about the future across animal welfare for demonstrating positive welfare outcomes. So we talk about, Jeff, you mentioned outcomes-based, percentage lameness, etc., cow comfort. There's actually, with all of the technology you were talking about yesterday, a combination of wearable sensors, machine vision, milk biomarkers, of developing, happiness index or wellness indexes where we're talking about, enrichment, activity, social behaviours, and actually demonstrating, telling a story as an industry about the positive welfare outcomes that we can put forward. So I guess, that's just another way of how we can use technology going forwards and data. But back to your original question, Steph. Can you just repeat that?
Andy and I were talking about answering the question you want to answer rather than the question that you were asked. Andy, I was just interested in terms of what are some of the things that industry are doing to be on that front foot. So Jack talked about, customers don't want to know all of the details unless there is a problem. So what are we doing as an industry to protect us from the problem, if that makes sense? The expose, the media challenges around bobby calves or things like that. What are we actually doing proactively to make sure that we don't end up in that situation?
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephen. I think the updates to the animal care commitments are a perfect example. One of those is the development of a surplus calf roadmap, which we've done now, and we're moving into implementation. But and I mentioned before regulatory overreach. The last thing we need is a knee-jerk decision that's made that says that you must now rear your calves to a certain age, which is what the case is in Europe, for example. Because if that was to happen overnight, practically speaking, that would be a disaster for the industry. It would be economically quite difficult to just shift gears. But what we're doing through the roadmap is showing to regulators that and to consumers, of course, that we're doing something proactively about what is a potential issue for us. So when there is an issue like the abattoir issue with TQM in Tasmania recently, we can say, look, no, the industry is working towards a better solution for this, and that's why it's really important. So, and then if you look at other parts of what is in the proposed updates for the animal care commitment, there's development of a whole of industry animal care assessment program. Again, it's to say that as an industry, our baseline level of animal welfare is well and above what regulators expect, and we're doing a really good job. And we are, but to be able to actually measure that objectively and doing it in a way that overseas customers also understand and value is really important. And then there's other stuff in there, as close to your heart, Steph, antimicrobial stewardship, actually showing that we're monitoring and creating a surveillance program to monitor for the development of antimicrobial resistance, and that we're using antimicrobials responsibly. Again, it's just getting ahead of any potential blowback from wherever that comes from.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Andy. So I'm going to bring it back to the audience in the room. My question to all of you, and so I'm going to go along the line starting with you, Scott, is what role does the herd improvement industry play in supporting industry to meet and communicate the dairy industry's amazing sustainability credentials? So I'm going to start with you first, Scott.
Good question. Yeah, it's an important role because there's a lot of data that people don't actually see. The consumers and government agencies, for example, they see it more from an environmental side. The animal welfare is often questioned in these big facilities because it's the concept of a cow in a shed. That doesn't sound good, but it's the misconception. So if there's data to support, it's not a production thing. So farmers are not necessarily putting cows in the sheds to get more milk, to get more money. That's a benefit, obviously, but it's the animal welfare is absolutely critical, as we discussed yesterday. So any information that comes out of genetics and that shows that these cows suit these facilities, we're not just taking any cow and just trying to make it adapt to an environment. That's not acceptable. But it's the broader community and probably government agencies, because they would not be aware of any of the data that's generated around genetics. It's not their focus. Their focus is communities and environment. So it's about making that link towards these farm systems, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Scott. Andy?
Sorry, Steph, can you repeat the question?
Andy, what role, so we've got an audience of herd improvement industry here. What's the role that they can play in terms of supporting both farmers and industry in communicating and demonstrating our sustainability credentials?
Yeah, speak to Erica at Data Connect.
It's a good point.
The work they're doing there, there's two barriers, I guess, from my perspective. We can have an aggregated, de-identified data set where we can say farmers doing X, Y, and Z to protect animal welfare, not looking for any information that's personal or sensitive, just wanting that whole of industry perspective so we can communicate to regulators, so we can communicate to consumers, both domestically and overseas. If we could have that, that's the ideal outcome. The barriers are quality entry on farm, and then the ability for herd management software, people that get data, tech providers, software companies, etc., to be able to help us facilitate the aggregation of that information by programs like Data Connect. If we can have that, that's all we're after. We're not, looking for all that. What we say, all the extra information, just the high level stuff that we can, help defend the industry and promote it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. Jack?
I think the context of all this data and data availability is to think about how we use that. So we've sat here now for a day and a half thinking, so what? So what does it mean for someone who's not in the industry, right? So how do I turn that into a narrative that says, yep, the data lines up, and the signal here, not the noise around the signal is we're getting better at this, and it's something we can articulate to externals, to us, right? So it's the so what piece. It's not just we've got lots more data, it's we've got a really compelling story that we can take with that data, and that sets us up to A, build trust, and B, attract people and resources and investment.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Jack. Jeff?
There's a few things. First of all, just being part of the ecosystem and being involved in the conversation at all levels. One of the most important roles I think that those of us involved in herd improvement can help is to make sure that we maintain a standard for quality of data, and particularly when we start talking about bringing in data from technologies, making sure that there's some kind of validation to show that it really does what it's supposed to do. Because I can tell you from personal experience, there are a lot of technologies that don't do what they're supposed to do. And then we say, oh yes, it's measuring this, but it's not really measuring that. So our tendency is to assume it measures it, but we've got to have some validation, and the herd improvement industry plays an important role in that validation process. in addition, I think it's in always questioning every stage of the process and making sure that things make scientific sense, biological sense, and practical sense. So one of the things that I worry about sometimes with some of our metrics is that there's a tendency to come up with a number and say, this is the number we should be. So, for example, everybody in this room has probably heard that cows need to lie down 12 to 14 hours a day. And I've taken the time to go back into the scientific literature, and that initial recommendation of 12 to 14 hours a day, I can't ever find where that came from. So somebody sets a standard at some point, and then it becomes the way. But one of the problems with that metric of 12 to 14 hours is it's really hard to get 14 hours a day of lying time, because cows have to eat and they have to milk, and I really don't see 14 hours. Having looked at lying time in a lot of scenarios, I don't see 14 hours except for in lame cows and dry cows.
Yeah.
And then you don't see it in pasture for sure. Pasture cows lay down the least, and I don't think that means a bad thing that they're laying down 9 or 10 hours. We have to be careful when thinking about the context of what we're measuring. Another thing that I think is important is that as we communicate as scientists, we tend to think in terms of data and graphs and so forth, but that isn't always remembered. People remember stories. So when I'm communicating about the dairy industry to my non-dairy friends, which admittedly there aren't very many of them, if I tell a story about my friend that spent 3 hours trying to get a calf to drink colostrum, or that got up 6 times during the night to make sure the cow had a calf in a safe manner, that does more than any kind of data that I can share.
Yeah.
So the storytelling aspect, I think, is so important as we communicate our messaging about what we do for the dairy industry.
Yeah, amazing, Jeff. And that was such a beautiful way to wrap up the formalised panel. I have seen a couple of questions come through on Slido, which is great. I was getting worried because that screen was very orange, and I was like, oh, so surely someone's going to have something other than me asking all the questions. So I'm going to start with the second question. So it's from Anthony. What are the insights or suggestions from the panel on what our genetic evaluation model and our genetic supply companies could do to adopt sustainability? Would anyone like to have a crack? Scott? Yep.
Yeah, the alley setters. So you often hear these farms transition to these sheds. There's a certain percentage of cows, not a large percentage, but cows just don't like the facility. Same with the AMS. They just don't adapt to the AMS. And you talk to some of these farmers, some of their good cows, they sit in the alley. They don't sit on the nice bloody bedding or the straw or anything else. If they're sitting in the alley, they're out of the shed, they're gone. Their life's somewhere else, going back another grazing farm. So it'd be good to understand if there's a connection around these cows that just don't adapt to these systems. Is it a breed type? Is it a genetic trait? Or is it a behaviour thing? I don't know. But there's farmers will say there's cows that just don't suit this system.
I'm thinking from our NBO discussion with Matt and Tim yesterday about the TMR index, so maybe our TMR index maybe is just a TMR ABV on cows that don't like to sit in their beds. Yeah. There's one to add to the NBO review. Thanks, Scott. That's actually really useful insight. I didn't mean to make light of the comment, but there's these sort of practical things that perhaps we don't necessarily pick up in existing data that's coming through, so that's great. Did anyone else want to add to that? Jeff, yep.
I think one of the opportunities is to think creatively about how we can select for things we hadn't selected for before, and to develop instead of thinking about how to change the system, to change the animal to better fit the system. And I applaud you all for being the first people in the world to develop a heat tolerance index. And that's a perfect example of saying maybe we need to change the animal a little bit to better fit the system. And with the data that we have from some of these sensors, we start looking at maybe we can change the animal a little bit to be more docile or more go with the flow or whatever, to avoid some of the challenges that we have that can come in housing systems, for example. So I think the technologies open up all kinds of doors for better modifying the animal to fit the systems that we have them in.
Yeah.
In a very ethical way.
Yeah, wonderful. Great point. Great point.
I was probably going to say something similar.
Yeah.
Stefan, like the development over the last 10 years of health traits, for example, a lot of our commitments focus on antimicrobial use and pain relief. You don't need those if they don't get the disease in the first place. So breeding those animals that are more inherently resistant to disease, I think is a really big plus not just from a productivity and efficiency sense, but from a welfare perspective as well.
Yeah, Claire, I chewed your ear off yesterday about exactly this point. Jack, would you like to add? Everyone's had a comment, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, so it's got to be something that, what's the single thing we can do? So bandwidth is limited, right? So what's the single thing we can do that drives farm profitability, drives a methane performance improvement of some sort? Heat tolerance, if you can bundle into that, because that's not going away. And then if we really could get polled on top of that for free, then I'm okay with that too.
Fantastic. Awesome. That's great. All right. In our 5 minutes remaining, we've got one question, and this one's directly for you, Jeff. So can you expand on the risks and advantages of using large data sets or management data for assurance?
I think I touched on some of that, and so much of it comes down to data quality, and we have different levels of data quality on different farms. So some of it just depends on what do we record. I see herds in the US, for example, with 0% ketosis according to their herd management records, but I don't think there are any herds with 0% ketosis. And I think another issue with data sets, again, we're using data sets sometimes for something other than their intended purpose, and that can create problems. And then I think we need to think about how we look at numbers statistically and understand some of the statistics of what we're looking at. So there's a tendency always to look at averages, but averages can lie to us.
Yeah.
Distributions sometimes tell us different stories, and we have to be really careful. Like I look at average days dry, for example, and I see lots of herds with the average days dry of 60 days, but half the cows are less than 40 and half are greater than 70. So that's not good.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful in understanding the data that we're looking at, and again, just making sure that we're asking the right question with the right data. There are lots of advantages, though. There's a lot of data that we haven't tapped into, and over the last decade, I've probably shifted my thought process a little bit from how do we collect more data with more sensors, although I'd still do that, to thinking more about how can we look at old data in new ways.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a big opportunity there.
I better come and talk to you. I've just applied to do my PhD in exactly that, Jeff, so I think we've got more conversations to have. Deanne, we've got a question down the back. Simone?
Yeah. Hi, Steph. It's probably a question for across the whole panel, and it's something that I think I've probably at some point spoken with Jack and Andy about. It's kept me awake on plenty of occasions around the industry is going down, Scott. We have intensive systems, but we still do pasture really well, and we have hybrid systems in the middle. From a sustainability perspective, and take your pick who wants to take this, how do we address this kind of multi-speed economy that we have in the dairy industry in Australia that's not a haves and it's not a have-nots? Jeff, you're talking a lot about outcomes, but the outcomes from one system to the next can be varied, but it doesn't make one better than the other. So how do we address that and maintain the integrity of the Australian dairy industry?
Do you know, I'm going to throw that question, Simone. I hope everyone's comfortable with me taking the liberty. I'm going to throw that one at Jack, because Jack and I have also had lots of conversations about exactly that topic. Simone?
So we just celebrate the diversity, Simone, right? Like there are two paths, and that's okay. And so those customers that care about grass-fed and they're out there and they'll pay more and we need to find them, then make sure they've got a supply chain that can do that. And let's try and do that without segregation, right? So go to Tassie. It's pretty easy there, because we saw from Scott's data yesterday, there's not much going on in Tassie in terms of sheds. So let's do it in the low-cost way. Let's do it without sort of segregating milk supply, because that's hard. But let's go to those customers and say, look, we've got attributes here that are interesting to you, so yep, let's have that. For those that don't care or want other things that can be given into a house sort of system, well, I think that's okay as well, right? So it's really about being smart about our marketing and then building a supply chain that cares about the customer at the end of it. And it's okay that there are many versions of what Australian dairy looks like. In fact, the more the merrier, right? Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. On that, we're out of time. So I want to, extend a huge thank you to all of our panellists, and I hope that was an interesting discussion. I could talk for hours with these guys about all of these various different things. So really appreciate each of you agreeing to come on board and join the panel, and to those that sent questions through. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you, E, with 45 seconds to spare.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. Well done.